daring souls, and welcome to the Mixed Up Mystics podcast. This is a show that offers a remix of Christianity straight from the bedazzled buckle of the American Bible Belt. If you're listening to this, it's probably because a friend turned you on to it. This is kind of the speakeasy podcast. It's not for everyone. That's why we keep it on the down low. In this episode, we're talking about origin stories. We're glad you're here. Sit back and join the conversation.
This podcast is a presentation of Pioneer Dream, celebrating 30 years of moving stories for our corporate, nonprofit, and entertainment partners. We invite you, fellow misfits, to join the conversation with text, emails, or just messages in the comment section below. As always, you can share this podcast with anyone you think would get it by sending the link now. Thanks for listening.
I'm Jay Webster. This is my co-conspirator, Ann Jeanette.
Hello.
And you may know us from our immensely popular and commercially successful other podcast, Dreamers Live.
I'm not sure that I know about that one.
Yeah. Checks are still coming in. So this is a great experiment because we are going to do, I guess what could be described as kind of an unvarnished, unfiltered conversation about all things spiritual.
I think that's it. It's like the director's cut on the, and that's how I look at it. On the Dreamers Live podcast, we have kind of a broader audience, and It is broad.
Yes.
Of all sorts of different people. But there are also some topics that are specific to spirituality and our thoughts on that.
Well, and that is for us. Yeah, for us, that's a weird thing because this is by and large for the last 30 years of our professional career. Mm-hmm. These are subjects that you and I have more or less stayed deeply away from.
Yeah, we don't like to talk about these things, but now we kind of do.
So let me just backtrack just for a second to see how we got here. Okay. So our fifth full-time job right now happens to be chaperoning all things that our daughter does. Our daughter Evangeline, who's now 12 and a half,
right,
careening into 21. She is involved in a myriad of things, and fortunately for us right now, she doesn't know quite how dorky we really are, and so she still likes us to be around. And so when there's a trip or an activity or a dance or an event, she will ask us to chaperone. And so maybe
we're still decently cool, like relatively cool.
She's just too young to know, really.
Yeah.
But about 2 months ago, we were on such a chaperoning expedition assignment.
There were many in May.
Yeah. And so this was a trip to Branson, Missouri.
Ooh, that just gives you the shakes even saying it.
I don't love it. This is just a side note. This is not why you called. I'm just going to tell you that I like bluegrass in very, very small increments. It has to be really good bluegrass for that. I don't love Silver Dollar City. I don't love bald knobbers and hokey stuff.
Well, I mean, that's like Branson at large, right? It's sort of like a country
the terrain and all that stuff and the state of Arkansas and all that.
Beautiful.
Gorgeous. Love all that.
I think Branson's in Missouri.
Is it? Oh, yeah, you're right.
Then
I hate it. Then if it's no, I just all that part of it I love. It's just the whole countrified thing that I'm just not deep into.
Like, so, how do you feel about Dollywood? Does that scare you?
I like Dolly Parton.
She's awesome,
but I don't know that I'd want to go to Dollywood.
Yeah. Okay. Well, because Evangeline mentioned, "Hey, does Dad know about Dollywood? That sounds fun." And I was like, "Oh, this is funny."
So we're on this trip. We have opted out of riding on the yellow school buses. And said, you know what we'll do? We'll bring up the rear in our own vehicle.
Yes.
Listen to our own stuff, and they'll meet you there.
Because we're going to be helpful, but not that helpful.
We will
right
chaperone the crap out of that.
And we did.
Yeah, man, we did.
Yeah.
So what was odd about that 3.5 hour trip there and 3.5 hours back is that it gave us all this time to talk about stuff.
Yeah.
And
because our daughter was in the bus, and so we got to talk. Yeah.
It's just the two of us. And so we were in the car, and we didn't plan on talking about things or going to some place, but we ended up in some conversation that just natural current took us into this spiritual thing and to what we would call the deep end of the pool.
Oh, yes.
And all of a sudden you're thinking, is it okay to talk about this stuff?
Can we
talk about this? Is this a safe place to be? And then also, does anybody else talk about this kind of stuff? And then there's another part of you that says, man, this gets into some weird stuff, but it's also super cool. And I kind of wish other people were listening in or being a part of this conversation.
Right.
And that's when you said, I know our other podcast, Dreamers Live, which can be found anywhere streaming now. I know it's immensely successful. And I know people want us to be just the Dreamers Live people. But
we got these other things.
Yeah, could we do something else? And so that's how we got to this place, this conversation. So we are going to try and do a conversation about spirituality. I can tell you that neither of us is qualified for these conversations.
We are not.
No.
We are not in the ministry. We have not studied these things other than just being alive.
Yeah.
And but we do think the uncensored conversations that we have about spirituality are enlightening and funny sometimes. And hey, it helps us just to talk about it.
So what also makes this odd is, and we'll get in, I want to get your origin story here in a second.
My whole origin story?
Your whole origin story in 5 minutes or less. And mine as well. But I will, this kind of summarizes, for those who don't know us or our background or whatever, this little story will give you some insight. So it just so happens that your dad is a pastor.
He is, and always has been since I've known him.
But he's also exceptionally cool. And he's cool enough that a lot of other pastors secretly try to get together with him to get input and to help in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so
it's like a pastor for pastors in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And so we, maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago, we had a friend who was coming into town, and she was bringing her significant boyfriend at the time.
Okay.
And it's a strange and daunting task for someone to bring in an unknown into our family and extended friend group, because
it's like an audition.
It is a bit of an audition. It's daunting and it's a little overwhelming for the outsider. So, so you can imagine, to make that thing worse, hey, I want to bring you in to meet some friends of mine in this mid-sized Oklahoma town called Bartlesville. And by the way, we're going to do that, but we're going to go to church first and then go from there. So there's a lot of screaming. Yeah, if you're the friend, there's just screaming red flags there. Just all kinds.
Was this?
This is about 20 years ago.
Oh, good gracious!
And so, you know, as was our tradition, we of course we churched it up, and then afterwards we ended up back at our house for cocktails. And so it's us and a couple friends.
See, therein, your statement that you just made is we just lost half of whoever's listening. The 3 people that are listening to us, 1.5. We went to church and then after had cocktails, which I think is great.
At our house, at a cocktail party at our house. And so we're kind of deep in the night, and there's lots of stories and laughter and probably some singing and I don't know what else.
You know what's funny? I still do not know what story you're telling, but I'm waiting.
So somewhere in the evening, it's getting pretty late, and everybody's kind of getting ready to close down, and we're saying, gosh, whatever his name was, Brad. That was not his name, but Brad is, man.
Like a Brad.
It was so nice to meet you. And man, you're so brave to be a part of this group and do all this. And he said, I think I've figured this out. I think I know what you are now. And I said, okay, well, let us know. He said, you're basically just free-range Christians. And I thought, I don't know if there's ever been a more appropriate description of who we are and what we are.
Like free-range chickens. They're the ones who get to roam free. They've maybe been college educated. You know, they do whatever they want.
And so let's talk origin story to figure out how we got to free-range chickens. So
are you going to go first?
You grew up, and your point of origin and family and background was what?
Well, my mom and dad were in ministry in the Baptist church, and not only the Baptist church, and part of the Southern Baptist Convention. Yes. So we're from Oklahoma, which you have actually affectionately called what have you called it?
Call it the belt buckle of the Bible Belt.
The belt buckle of the Bible Belt.
That's right, and we're the rhinestones of the belt buckle.
Yeah, exactly. So although my parents, honestly, were always cool and open-minded and loving to everyone, I was raised in a broader church culture that was very restrictive, although it was also really loving, and I have a lot of great memories, a lot of good background in being a decent human. So it wasn't all bad at all. It was more that it was insular. So especially because my parents were in the ministry, that's where we spent all of our time, and that was their job.
So on an average week, how many days were you actually in a church building?
Okay, well, if it was summertime, it would have been almost like 6, because you'd have vacation Bible school, and then you'd have your Sunday. On a normal school week,
you should be better off than you are.
I know, it's so sad. It's like the minister's daughter always has problems, and now you know.
Yeah.
But no, and during the week it would have been like Wednesday church, Sunday morning, Sunday night. So for those of you who don't know, that's when you go to church in the morning and you do church, and then you go home and you're like, oh, this is so great, it's Sunday, we should relax. And you're like, nope, back to church at 5 o'clock. Then there was choir practice on Tuesday. So 4 nights a week. I mean, it was a big part of our life.
Multiple times in those 4 times a week. That's 4 days a week. That's crazy.
Sunday was a doubleheader.
And so from there, your dad was doing what and ended up where?
Okay, so my mom and dad, like I said, were always there, musicians, and they're very open-hearted and very loving. And they started just, I think, having a desire as they grew up and we got older, just to have a spirituality that was more free and more open, and also that included more people, that wasn't so restricted by the denomination that we were in.
Right.
And so my dad had always been a music minister, and my mom alongside him. And then they... then
he was also a youth minister.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. He actually was music and youth. Yeah. So he was the youth group leader. And I really feel like his first church, honestly, was the youth group that I grew up in.
Yeah.
It was where he, taught people how Jesus was real, the friendship that can be there. He taught us as a youth group to learn how to read the Bible maybe a little bit each day, or learn how to pray, to have some ownership and some, to not base that on your parents, but to have a friendship and freedom. So it was actually kind of revolutionary to people, this idea that God would be a friend, that he's interested in your daily life, so you can talk with him every day. So that's kind of where his, I guess, pastoral, to use a big word, inklings began. Right. And then he and my mom felt like they were to start their own church. Okay. And that would be free range. Yes. We're back to the free range. Yeah, or non-denominational. It was the 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So.
Yeah, it's the beginning of a lot of what we know the church has today. I mean, things kind of went non-denominational.
Exactly. That became like a real cool thing. Oh, yeah, we go non-denominational. We have a band and all that. Well, my parents were doing that 25 years ago, like before it was cool. Yeah. And it was really controversial. So my dad has always been what you might describe as a pioneer, kind of a revolutionary, to his own demise, really. Yeah. I mean, career-wise, but always wanting to demonstrate the reality of who God is and that he's for everyone. Yeah. And was willing to risk his success for that. And my poor mom is awesome. Yeah. She loves more traditional things, but she's always gone with it. She's super cool. And I'm really proud that they're my parents. I've watched the evolution over the years, and they're still true to who they are.
Yeah, so. I can add to that. I mean, that the freedom of this experience, the freedom of truth, and trying to hold to whatever that is, and not just subscribe to an institution or to institutional rules, has made your dad kind of who he is. Mm-hmm. And but it's also been costly in the experience. So, it's as we say, it's really not hard to earn money. It's just what are you going to do? What are you going to sacrifice to get there? Yeah, it's really not that difficult to have bigger congregations. It's just what you're going to do to do that. And so, at some point, because I was there for some of that. Your dad's church population was, somewhere between 500 and 600 people. Yeah, and it was a big group. And for our community, it was kind of it was like the first mega church. It was blacked out ceilings and there's TV screens in the coffee shop and
we had activities.
And then to be true to what inspiration he had and to try and kind of stop some of the consumerism based church going, he began to make some changes, and just those minimal small changes helped alleviate him from about 450 people very quickly.
Which is a little risky when you make your living based on people giving.
Tremendous weight loss program. How did you lose 450 people? Well, you just tell them that it's not all about them, and maybe to move on.
That's right. If it were a business, it would have been like, we just lost 85% of our clients, and have fun with that.
So enough about you. Let's talk about
now you're
So I grew up in a great Irish Catholic family, and I went to an Irish Catholic school. So I which was really a godsend for me. I needed a lot of that, and I needed some of that constant contact. It also came for me personally with some baggage, so there was a whole lot of the weight of guilt. And I mean, Catholics really can't excel in guilt. And
there are a lot of good things, but guilt is one of the challenges.
And the heaviness of that and the ritual of it. And so the ritual is great if you choose to make it alive. At 7, 8, 9, 10, I was not making that ritual alive.
But the nuns loved you so much at school, so much so that they put you next to them, right?
All the time. And but it also it taught me some of the value of kind of being in a meditative state and owning some of that.
Like spiritual practice.
Yeah, I think so. And certainly discipline, and then also created a lot of awareness of our personal responsibility. Responsibility to, in a faith scenario, responsibility for each other. So this idea of, Catholics really excel at charitable stuff and serving and all that kind of stuff.
Very giving.
So I feel like that was a huge inheritance in that whole experience. But somewhere around 17 or so, 18 or so, you and I met, we had conversations, and they were kind of eye-opening conversations. And it was my first time to kind of consider something outside of the Catholic Church. As you and I've talked about before, it was at that moment for me, and I think it was kind of true for a lot of denominations, there were Catholics and everybody else.
Yeah. Well, and we talked about this before. Yeah. That's what's so funny. That
was on the Dreamers Live podcast.
Oh, yeah.
So this completely new audience probably doesn't have.
That's really true. It is for all the wonderful things that the Baptist Church afforded me growing up. There was also this feeling in the Baptist Church, like there's kind of like Baptists and then everybody else. Yeah, right. And the Catholics, by the way, we really had to be concerned about the Catholics. Absolutely. They were, which is why I found you so brooding and mysterious. Right. I think because you were risky. You were Catholic, and I thought it sounded fun.
So about 17, I started thinking I wanted to have a different, a little bit different experience or different ownership. But there was something about this less traditional, less ritualistic relationship and experience that was very appealing to me at that time. Right. And so, it was great. Later on, we of course got married, and that was great. And we ended up helping your dad with what he was doing in his church here and there, not in any kind of no paid position or anything, nothing like that. We're not in the ministry like that. But it was enough that it was like, hey, it was about being culturally relevant. It was about big picture stuff. And so in that way, I was really honored to be a part of that because he really helped shape that experience of asking questions and all that kind of stuff. So,
yeah, absolutely.
So meanwhile, probably about 20 so years ago, at the same time, we start to see, we didn't know at the time, we didn't know that's what it was happening, but about 15 or 20 years ago.
20 or 15.
20 or 15. 220.
220, whatever it takes.
It's a Chicago song.
It is.
And,
that's right.
So anyway, we start seeing what are the beginnings of what I would consider the fall of fundamentalism.
Oh, wow. You're going deep early on.
Yeah. So there's this whole thing. We've set this culture of Christianity, and it's really heavy, and it's quickly going outside of just the church doors. It's going into politics, and it's going into entertainment.
Would you say fundamentalism was at its height maybe in the 90s, 80s, 90s? Like everything in our country was big. I think church was big, mega churches.
I would say kind of it had a 20-year span from about 1985 to about 2005.
Okay.
That's this run.
Yeah. Of like, this is the way to do it. Yeah, that's true.
And then somewhere in there,
there was so much. I'm sorry to interrupt you. There was a separatism.
Oh my gosh.
Is how I would. So fundamentalism is a big word, but that's true. Even the way that I grew up, despite my family being very open, the culture that I was within was you've got to protect yourself.
Yes.
If you're going to live for God, you've got to.
And then quote
the world.
Right.
Yeah.
And you wanted to stay as far away from the world.
The world, which cracks me up because I want to be. Now I'm like, you mean regular people, just people? Right. But that was it. I mean, it was you've got to. Now you want to go out and share some good news about God with people, but you need to be super careful because they're going to rub off on you, and you got to separate.
It would be safer for us just to stay in the church buildings and listen to our own music.
So let's just do that, and
listen to our own music and watch our own shows.
That's exactly what it was. And then comes the onslaught of Christian music and Christian movies and all these things, so that we can just be over here neat and safe.
Yeah.
and not be around anybody else.
Right.
Before you know it, that's where you are all the time.
The problem was, we kind of felt, and this is weird stuff too. This is so weird to be talking about this.
It is weird.
And recording it because
this is what we talk about.
These are private conversations, but these are not conversations we would have with a lot of other people.
That's true. And normally we will, if we've had these conversations, we'll have had a cocktail or two.
Oh, man,
so
it's easier, but
this is just regular us.
So we have kind of always felt like and believed that, okay, if you're going to believe that there is a, quote, God.
Mm-hmm. Why'd you quote it?
Because the whole thing is because it's
up?
like there was what we have adopted and what we've kind of lived by is that, okay, then there's this experiential part of it. There's,
right.
There's of course the ancient scriptures and all that stuff, what we would call the Bible. There's, this relationship stuff, where people quote, go to church.
Mm-hmm.
I'm using a lot of quotes here.
Yep.
And then there's what we have kind of experienced, which is this experiential, personal relationship, personalized part of this thing. And in that stuff, just like, you and I have been married for now 32 years ago. And who we were, yes,
wow.
when we got married at 6 and 7.
Yes.
We were vastly different people in that moment.
I know. Aren't you ever embarrassed of your old self?
A little bit, but more than that, I'm grateful because you changed so much from 20 to 30 and 30 to 40 and then 40 to whatever we are now, 36.
Yes.
And
I like that.
and so you change so much, and that's such a natural occurrence. And then if you're lucky, you grow in the same direction. You and your spouse or you and your significant other grow in the same direction, and you and I happen to.
Right.
Well, I feel like that in terms of this spiritual connection or the spiritual relationship. So who I knew God as and who I knew him to be en masse at 8 years old at Holy Name Catholic Church in Coffeyville, Kansas, has evolved and grown and changed drastically now that I'm this age.
Yeah.
And
just like our relationship, I mean, I know more about you and there's a depth there. It's different than what it was like when we were 17 or 18.
Yes. Right. So we have this thing and this DNA in us that I think is spiritual. It's divine. It's a connection to this whole thing.
I agree.
If you're not of the spiritual persuasion or not of the Christian persuasion, you might call that the universe,
Right.
But I believe that thing is divine. I believe it's spiritual. I believe it's in us. And I believe it's constantly awakening things, revealing things, showing things. And so when the wall started crumbling around fundamentalism, whatever that was 15 or 20 years ago, a lot of it was because this DNA was pulling us in other directions. We would get to pop culture moments, music or movies that were expressly not Christian movies, and yet you would feel God in it, and you couldn't get away with it. You couldn't escape it. You're like, oh my gosh!
Wait, that wasn't a Christian song.
Yeah,
it was just a quote song.
Yeah, and so then cracks began to break because you were having these divine moments, spiritual moments, and they had nothing to do with being in a quote church service or at church.
Totally outside of it.
I'm going to keep track of how many quotes I give.
Okay,
quotes
maybe we should we chill the quotes or all right.
Once you get on the quote train, it's really hard to get off.
I know.
So we were having that experience, and then there were people who were of the world.
Okay, you mean regular people,
who were not part of your church group, and yet there was this divine connection in them and with them.
Yeah.
And that was troubling because this was not supposed to make sense. Here you are connecting with these people in these very deep, wonderful ways. Yeah. And they don't really believe like you believe or believe.
And listen, you don't want to start thinking during all this and using the brain that God gave you.
And then the really horrible, terrible stuff started happening because, I started working at different places, and I worked at a bar here in town for a while because it was just a bucket list thing. I wanted to learn how to do real bartending. I wanted to know like mixology stuff.
I remember I
not an Applebee's kind of stuff, but I wanted to know how do you make old fashions and how do you make cosmopolitans and how
dirty
do you do
martinis and all that, rat
all that kind of stuff. And
for sure.
And so I started working at the Solo Club. on Friday and Sundays and had a great time. And I met all these amazing people.
That was a fun phase of our life.
And talk about a church. I mean, man, they were just an amazing group of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they cared for each other.
Yeah, and they cared for me, and they took care of me, and
became like family.
Yeah, and so,
and we're like, wait.
Yeah, so you start hanging out you start hanging out there, on different days, and your friends would be there, and somebody would say, "Hey, can we get together?" And a friend would come in and say, "Oh, well, let's meet up at the bar and we'll do that stuff." And so next thing you know, to make matters worse, we're hanging out at the bar with all these people who aren't allowed in the church, and then you find yourself you're with gay people, and you're like, well, and then there's tremendous divine love and connection and relationships there that you just can't deny. And so now you're thinking, well, what do I do with this? Yeah. So those were things and conversations that would not have been a problem, with your dad or in that movement, but with the American church at large, it's obviously been difficult stuff to get around. So we thought, hey, that would be a great impetus for a podcast. Let's talk about things that are a little dangerous. Yeah. Let's get to the deep end of the pool.
This is sort of the intro. Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing is, if we had not separated ourselves back out to the regular people, if we had not just, been normal and gone out and had jobs or, gone to college, done all that, we never ever would have set foot in a place like the Solo Club. We never ever would have been around just people. Yeah. And I'm so thankful for the way that our life went. We were able to travel some, which I think is so important, because if all you ever see is the surroundings around you, then that's all there is to you. And so I remember we would have these conversations, and we get to go to places like Chicago and spend time, and our eyes would just be opened just to all these other people. And I'm so thankful that in a way that we were brave enough, and that we had like someone like my dad to look to, and others that say, hey, it's okay to just go out and be normal.
Well, your dad was the first.
Or I'd still be at choir practice, kids.
Your dad was the first person to, I think, pull the curtain back a little bit and say, hey, this thing that you have been sold on as Christianity or spirituality or faith or whatever, you've been kind of sold
a lie,
a masked version of it, a cloaked version of it, and that was the kind of a lights on experience for us to say, oh, so you're saying there is a culture of Christianity, and then there is the practice or the person or the relationship of Christianity. Yeah, there's this caricature of a faith, and then there's this other thing over here which can be alive. And so it's been very difficult for us to be a part of that or share or talk about that, because the caricature version of this thing is so gross to us. Yes. And so difficult. We haven't wanted to be associated with that.
Yeah, we've had to disassociate. I remember a really good friend of mine, I'll just give a shout out to Rhonda. She's another person in my life that I've had these kind of deep spiritual conversations with. And she and I can switch into that like immediately. Right. She's got such a sweet heart. She cares about people. And she said she said to me, it's actually very forward thinking, because it was probably about 15 years ago. She goes, I'm just around people, and I think maybe sometime there'll be something that people who believe in God are called that's not Christians, because she says, I just don't want to identify with it that way. Maybe it'll just be lovers of God, or, that type of thing. And I thought that was so interesting. And that's it. So you and I, as our eyes and heart began being open to all these other things, I think we've spent about 15 or 20 years like, sorry, no, no, I'm sorry. When the truth is at our core, we both try to follow who Jesus is without being part of all of that culture. And it's not easy, because basically people don't get you from either room.
Yeah, we've discovered, I think, that, there are a lot fewer hills that we want to die on. That we want to wrestle people over, that we want to fight over.
Yeah, who cares?
And I think, at its core, we've been trying to get back to the simplicity of this connection. So for me, this person of Jesus is very real. The expression of that has broadened, and what that looks like has broadened, but it's really it is the practice of Christianity that has opened my heart and mind to considerations and thoughts and worlds that I never would have considered otherwise. Yeah. It's the culture of religion that I have felt suffocated by and confused by and frustrated by. Yeah. But practicing that, being meditative, considering ancient scriptures, talking and being with this person on a spiritual plane, Jesus, all that has opened everything up.
I was just going to say, I mean, that's the irony, right? People, I think, tend to think, oh, well, if you're religious, sorry, I brought the quotes out again, but if you're religious or this and that, you're not using your mind, you're not thinking, you're not aware of others, because of the closedness of that culture. Formerly, is that a word? Formerly, sure. Yes. But because I remember when you and I met, I remember we were in American literature class. Sure. I think I was 16 and you were 17. Is that right?
I think that's a song too.
I'm 16 going on 17. Yeah. But we had met before. But I remember reading, because I knew the scriptures and because I had a belief in God. It was all 80s up at the time for me, but it was sincere. I remember reading poetry. I remember reading literature and different things. And it was like the symbolism and the stories and the beauty of that was alive. It was like everybody else was just sitting around in class smoking or whatever. And I was like, this Shakespeare, of course, that's English literature, but is amazing. And I remember seeing that in you is because we were both spiritually minded. We were the only ones who cared about that stuff. But because I knew God and that place in my heart was, I guess, alive, it's opened up everything for me versus the closedness that I could have accepted. And I've watched you evolve over the years into you have a very sincere faith, but you're also a very spiritual thinker and a writer.
Wow.
You are.
Genius is such a big word.
Okay. I'm pretty sure I didn't say genius, but but to me, that's the irony of it, right? You have this culture that's tried to keep you closed and away. And the truth is, I think when you really, try to find God, or one of my favorite scriptures is work out your own salvation, figure out where God is in this for you. Man, it's like, it's in everything. Yeah. It is the beauty and the joy and the poetry and the kick-ass rock song, all those things.
I think you're so right. I mean, I think about what I'm aware of now in my life versus, even 5 or 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it's the person of Jesus and being in some kind of relationship where he keeps you honest. The Spirit of God, in a sense, looks in us and lives in us, and will tell you about your own shit. He will expose.
He will call you on your shit.
And so that has been my experience. Is that in certain parts of my life, that relationship has caused me now to, instead of hoarding my time, my family, and trying to keep myself insulated away from other people, now all of a sudden I find myself loving people more. Yeah. I find myself more generous. I find myself more empathetic, more caring, more open. All that is because of this relationship. Yeah. So whereas one version of this religion or faith, or Christianity, wanted to insulate, wanted to segregate, wanted to separate me and confine me into this true experience of it, what I believe is the true experience of it, instead did the exact opposite. Now I feel more open. Now I feel more loving. Now I feel more welcoming. Now I want to connect more. Yeah. And as far as I can see, and reading the accounts of who this person was when he was walking the planet, that's how Jesus was. Yeah. That's who Jesus was. Those were his values. And so when you look at those, what we would call the Gospels, and here it is, Jesus is, recorded to be God's rescue plan. Things are a mess. Yeah. We need help. I'm going to send my son Jesus. Here we go. And in all those accounts, all 4 of those books that we call the Gospels, maybe 10% of that has anything to do with heaven. 80% of it has everything to do with how we treat each other and how we live on this planet with him.
Yeah.
And so instead of always being dreamy-eyed about some far-off location and some other
someday in eternity,
it's the getting dirty now.
Yeah.
It's the doing the work now. It's the connecting with people now. It's how you and I live with each other now, not in some future state.
We've talked about this before. Do you remember back in Philosophy 101 in college?
Probably not. But you
I was paying attention.
Yes,
I found it very.
The notes.
I did take the notes. Yes, and let you share my book. But anyway, there was this thing. The first thing they tackle, right? You're like a college freshman, and they're like, "We're going to talk about eternity and religion," and you're like, "Okay." Yeah. You're there at your regular state school instead of the Christian school that all your other friends went to. Right. Thank the Lord for that, right? Yeah. So glad we went to just school, as they call it. But go Sooners. But there was this thing called the categorical imperatum.
Okay.
And you are welcome. I can't find my keys, but I can remember that pretty easily.
Good job.
But the idea was they were trying to use sort of math to determine if God did exist and if it mattered in eternity or not.
Right.
And so it basically came down to the idea, if you don't believe in eternity, and you don't follow God, then, you're fine. But say you do follow God and you live this way and you die and there's still no eternity, you're still better off believing that was there. So there was that part of it. Yeah. But the part that I think of is this: even if we've modeled our lives or tried to live our lives following who Jesus is, and eternity was always such a huge, huge, huge thing growing up. It was basically heaven, screw the world, heaven, we're leaving, woo, right? But if we're there, if heaven doesn't exist, but we have lived our lives based on these things that make a beautiful life, then we won. Right. So that's where the categorical imperatum comes back to me. But the idea is, even if eternity doesn't exist. And the truth is, we all think we know what we believe, but we don't know for sure on this side of things. Following who Jesus is, I'm grateful that I've tried to do that, because I really we're not perfect, but I think it's the sweetest, most peaceful, best way to try and live. Yes. I mean, I just watched that, it's, I'm thankful for that. It's a way that we've tried to live our life, and I'm glad.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's not hard, and it doesn't mean it fixes everything. It doesn't. But can you imagine having lived without some of those principles? It'd be sad.
I'd be a much less happy person. Not just because of the prospect of heaven, but just I would be so less connected to the humanity that's around me, and that has made me feel so rich and has made me feel so happy just to know and love and be loved at that depth. I mean, that's rescued me so many times. I mean, to not have this and to not have that be the impetus of of all that goodness in my life.
It's why, because we believe in things and we believe that we have a purpose. It's the reason we're even doing something like this, or doing Dreamers Live, or keep writing music when no one cares and you don't feel like it, because you feel like the one who made you. You feel that presence and that peace and love when you do those things, and it keeps you on the hunt. Yeah. Other than, so you don't go to the couch in your life,
Pretty much Jesus is the only person who could make me do this.
Talk about him on a stupid podcast.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's so true. But hey, the thing about
this is a little like being part of a family.
This is awkward.
Like, it's like being a part of a family that you're embarrassed of.
Yes.
And maybe they're embarrassed of you too.
Probably.
But at some point, it's still your last thing. You still have to.
Yeah. And we've avoided talking about this kind of stuff for so long for the aforementioned reasons. Right. But we're also at a place in our life. Don't let me speak for you if you're still not being honest.
Sure.
But for me, man, I mean, the older you get and the more you figure things out, or the less both, we're just all about being honest and being authentic and trying to be genuine in whatever we do. So this is a big part of who we are, and not everybody wants to hear about it, and that's fine.
So you really don't have to.
We get asked this stuff a lot, so it's just cool to talk about it. And by the way, the thing that is so interesting to me, quick side note, because we could go on about this all day, is when we talk about following Jesus, I mean, he was a badass.
Mm-hmm.
He was a revolutionary. He was cool. He was counterculture.
Is
badass?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's the Arabic translation, I think.
It's not this image, that we were maybe sold a long time ago of this completely peaceful, type person. He was a revolutionary. He, following that pattern has, I feel like, given us the guts to be risk takers in our creative life over and over and over again, looking at that model. And so, but I had to be open and ready, and you had to be open and ready to follow something that we, that was worth fighting for and living for. So,
well, and for me, I mean, 30 some odd years in, it still matters. It still makes sense to me. It does. It's more imperative and more important today than it was when I started that connection.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. So I didn't know what we were going to talk about today. This was you went right. Please. You were like, hey, let's just try this one out.
Dive into the deep end, man.
I mean, but you're right though. If the 3 people that are going to listen to this, it was good to do the intro today. That was pretty smart. That way they know.
Well, and you 3 people may have things you want to talk about.
Yes.
And if you do, you can email us or message us or put them in the comments part of this. And you may not want to share this with other people because it's probably just too good and you want to keep it to yourself.
Yes. And we said badass and Jesus together.
Yes. Yeah. But if you're not, if you want to just like it or subscribe to it or forward it or share it, we would greatly appreciate it. And we'll talk about things like Christian nationalism and if God is mad at us and if there is a God and all that stuff. We'll be talking about all that stuff in upcoming episodes. But we're so grateful that you took a risk in listening to this, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Yeah. And that's it for the episode 001, and we will see you soon.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Peace out.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, share it with a friend. And check out Pioneer Dream's other podcast, Dreamers Live, a conversation about living intentionally, and Got a Minute, a podcast that pairs short humor columns with original music.